I'll be using the word fat a lot throughout the whole evening. I identify as a fat activist and a fat person. And I'm going to get a little more into sort of the politics of what that means, but essentially my practice is largely about writing. I do a lot of speaking engagements at universities and events like this, and in corporate spaces, helping people to understand how the attitudes that our culture has towards higher weight people are a sign of stigma and discrimination, and how we can change that and get rid of that so that every person of every single size can live their best life. I have a column with Forbes, on Forbes.com, where I write about the impacts of weight discrimination for women at work. And I also cover the plus size fashion market for Forbes. And finally, I have a podcast called Rebel Eaters Club. We just finished the first season, and it's a food positive, body positive podcast, where we talk to various people in the world of food and body justice around how we can radically transform our relationship to eating, from one that is based in anxiety to one that's based in excitement, enthusiasm, pleasure, and joy. So again, my name is Virgie. Thank you for being here. Alex, do you want to introduce yourself?
I would love to. Thank you, Virgie. Uh, I'm so excited to be in conversation with you. Just like listening to you talk about your work, I'm so smitten. So it's a pleasure and a privilege. My name is Alex Locust. I am a counselor, a community organizer, disability justice champion. I call myself a glamputee, so I'm trying to give you some of that glam tonight. Virgie and I got the same memo, black and gold. Didn't plan that. Just some eloquence for the evening. I work in San Francisco full-time as a harm reduction counselor at the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. So I provide support around substance use and the harm reduction framework, which I will talk more about later. But on top of that, when I'm able to, I do community organizing around disability justice. So that might be me going into spaces and facilitating workshops. And sometimes when I have the opportunity, it also means that I host my own workshops, which I call Spill the Disability, right? Lots of bad puns in my life. You're welcome in advance. And that's kind of my space where I'm trying to really celebrate the work of the disability justice movement and help spread the word, right? And really kind of shout it from the rooftops. I think one of the North Star for me is, for as much as I want there to be community building around disability justice, I also, in that process, really want to center the experiences of disabled people. I think I've been to enough workshops where it sounds like we're talking about a group of people as if they're not there. And I really want disabled people to feel like their voices are important and at the forefront when we're talking about these things. So I've had the pleasure of doing that for the past couple of years. I get to do all sorts of fun things in relationship to that. Do some runway shows. I jury for disability film festivals. Lots of different things that I'd be happy to talk about throughout tonight. But definitely love the intersection of disability justice and fat activism, and really excited. I'm going to turn it back to, well, I guess I'm looking at, if you ever see me look over, this is me checking my notes. This seems like the time to kind of transition to talk about, why we're here. I know we talked about it a little bit, Virgie, but, for me, Virgie, your work, when was that? Was a couple of years ago at the Stud, when you read a little bit from You Have the Right to Remain Fat, and tapping into different resources like She's All Fat as a podcast and learning more about fat activism. Just, it felt like there were so many parallels in how bodies are policed. I felt a lot of empathy in my relationship with being born as an amputee, and how it sounded like, fat bodies are policed in that way. And so I really, I kind of dug deeper. And so it's exciting to kind of talk about like what does it mean to have a good body, and why does everybody have a good body? Virgie, why are you here tonight?
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I think that you bring so much love and light and joy and glam to the political conversation. One thing that I often remind people is that we often think of political movements and political work as hard and intense and heavy, and there's sort of a lot of drudgery and there's a lot of fear and danger, and there are those components, but that we're all sort of working towards justice, which is actually joyful. And it's always helpful for me to remember when we reach our goal of justice and equity and fairness, that that world is beautiful and fun and sparkly and full of laughter. And so, I see you as someone who really broadcasts that and reminds us of that future that we're kind of all working towards, and what that can feel like in the body, and what it can look like in interactions. So for me, I did my undergraduate work at UC Berkeley, and living in Berkeley at that time, which was really the birthplace in many ways of the disability rights movement. I felt like I saw the way that access had been created, the way that space had been created, and I wasn't in sort of aware of fat activism or body politics or body positivity or anything at that time. But many years later, once I would finally come into that, I would see the intersections of kind of like, right, what does it look like to deal with and ask for a world where my body as it exists is accommodated, and I am not requested to make myself smaller or make myself fit into infrastructures and worlds and classrooms and airplane seats and train seats that weren't built for me. And so the intersections between disability justice, fat activism, and certainly, I mean, right, like mental health is just right there in the conversation because of how stigma in particular creates outcomes like anxiety and depression, isolation, etc. And similarly, right, like many times people who are experiencing fat phobia or ableism may also be like having standalone mental illnesses they're also grappling with, that may be even exacerbated by their experience of discrimination. So that's why I'm here. And Alex really pointed out when we were talking about preparing for tonight that it was important to say that we do not represent entire groups of people. Actually, would you like to talk about that, Alex?
Yeah, absolutely. I, in doing this work, recognize, right, disability justice was proposed by, or came into fruition from the minds of, queer, Black and brown disabled people, right? And while I also identify as queer and brown and disabled, I also have privilege, and we have privilege being here tonight, right, and having this platform. And so I really, I'd just like to name that and acknowledge that I'm speaking from my experience. And while I may reference work or reference movements, I certainly don't want my perspective, or our perspective to be considered kind of the law, or speaking on behalf of other people. I think that can get really dangerous. And further, this idea that these communities are monolithic. Your work is unpacking the intersections of being a fat woman of color. And, I think when we flatten these things, we can really lose a lot of the nuance. So I'm excited to share about my personal experience, and I'm excited to hear yours, and just kind of offer that to everybody, that, whether it's through the Q&A or conversations that we have after this, that there's so many other voices that we'll try to celebrate tonight, but also, like, in the scope of an hour, we'll do what we can.
Yes. I mean, I'm thinking about how often people tell me regarding like the monolithic experience. A lot of people ask me, I don't feel comfortable using the word fat. It feels like a really impolite word. And I often say, right, I'm a fat person who really likes that word, who feels comfortable with that word, and who uses that word to describe her own body. And there are plenty of people who look just like me who do not feel comfortable with that word. And so really letting people sort of name their own experience, their own identity when you're talking about them and with them. So if you, yeah, so like, if you feel kind of like that sense of maybe slight discomfort, I think that that's a good thing, and it's okay to just feel that discomfort moving forward. I kind of wanted to acknowledge also, before we get really further into the conversation, that certainly I bring a trauma-informed approach to the talk that we're having and to the work that I do. To begin with, right, like, one of the things that you learn really quickly when you're involved in any political movement, for the most part, is that you are organizing and sharing community with people who have been wounded by the thing that is galvanizing you to be political. And so what that kind of looks like is that we're all trying really hard to make the best of a situation that is really difficult and that we did not elect to be a part of, right? Like, nobody elects into being oppressed. People, like, right? So this is like a non-consensual experience that we're trying to manage, and we're trying to sort of create a safer world for similar people, and right, we're trying the best that we can, but we're also deeply impacted by the experience of being oppressed, right? And I think it's important to I think, for a long time I thought of oppression and trauma as sort of separate things. In actuality, being part of a marginalized group, whether you're a fat person or a person of color or a queer person or a disabled person, that is a cultural form of trauma. So for me, right, when I think about being at the intersections of being a person of color and being like a woman and being fat and growing up working class and growing up with immigrant parents raising me, these are all access points for that kind of oppression and that kind of trauma. And so one of the things that I've really sort of, for my own practice, have moved forward practicing is understanding that we're all, like, especially when you're in community with other people who are like you, we're trying really hard. We're going to mess up. We're just human beings. And, I think that giving ourselves that latitude and that grace, at least for me, has been a really, really important part of the work that I do. And I think the last thing I want to say on the trauma-informed piece is that for a lot of us, trauma and oppression are what galvanizes us into action. They're what galvanize us into politically organizing, trying to find similar community. And I think there's something really extraordinary and powerful about that. And so for me, trauma isn't like a bad word. Of course, it is unfair. It is sometimes, right, like, we don't recover. Some people never recover from the traumas that they experience. And I'm not saying that that's okay, but I am saying that people who have experienced oppression, trauma, have extraordinary tools. And so, if you're someone who's experienced marginalization or multiple marginalization, you can kind of claim that experience, and it doesn't have to put you into a mindset of feeling like this is negative and this will always mark my life in a bad way. And so, for me, I often think about, the archetype of, like, in the tarot, I think about the high priestess who has experienced so much trauma, and is able to sort of alchemize her trauma, make magic of her trauma, turn her trauma into tools and medicine for herself and for others she cares about. And so I wanted to sort of bookend the conversation by talking a little bit about that. Alex, did you have anything else to add about trauma-informed conversations?
Man, you said so many things that I just really appreciate. And you started talking about tarot. I know we're talking about that later. So how about I just affirm and appreciate, right, this trauma informed approach, right? Because I know, this can be a charged conversation. And so just providing that space and that compassion for each other, modeling that, and then hopefully, providing people that permission to like be messy, need that support, right? Kind of galvanizing through this and striving towards joy, right? I think that's just those are the things that are ringing true to me. So why don't we like jump in, right? Because I feel like our time's like already flying by. What does everybody is a good body mean to you, Virgie?
Oh, Alex. I love this question. Everybody is a good body was actually a phrase that I was introduced to in fat activism. So I came into fat activism in around the year 2010 when there was not a body positivity movement really. And I was introduced to it sort of by a network of friends. And kind of like, I have to share really quickly that the way that I found fat activism was somebody was like, hey, have you ever heard of this fat conference? It's in Oakland. It's like in 2 weeks. You should go. And it's like, it's like, and I was like, no, I've never heard of this conference. Okay, I live near Oakland. I'm going to go. And so I was in grad school. I was able to apply for financial aid and got a really generous grant to go. And it's this conference called No Lose. It was originally specifically for lesbians of size. And then it kind of became a conference that was focused on queer people and allies. And it kind of blew my mind, right? Like I was introduced to, first of all, it's like I walk into this space and everybody's like fat and amazing and laughing and hanging out and being friends, and it's blowing my mind. And so everybody is a good body was a phrase that I learned sort of as I was being introduced to fat activism. And it was kind of, we attributed it at that time to this incredible queer performance artist and activist named Glenn Marla. And that was kind of their tagline that we all kind of recognize as like their thing. So that was like the first time I ever heard it, was like in reference to the idea that fat people weren't defective, that body diversity was this incredible thing, that it was okay if you were fat, it was okay if you were thin, it was okay if you were somewhere in the middle, and that we could create room to celebrate fat people being hot and sexy and stylish and fierce. And so for me, like it really began with that context of fatness. Because, right, there's kind of this prevailing cultural idea that fat people are deviant, that fat people are, I often use the phrase like failed thin people. And the truth is that fat people are not failed thin people. We're just good at being fat, right? And so in that way, like we have kind of a secret talent. And so, but our culture doesn't really see being fat as a talent in the way that I do, and people in the know do. So, I think to really claim my body is a good body is to refuse the idea that there's something pathologically wrong with my body, that my body is ugly, that my body can't do things, that it's like, I mean, these are all things that kind of sort of are about stigmatizing fat bodies. And for sure, there's stuff, right? Like there's certain things that I'm better at doing because I'm fat, and that I'm not as good at doing because I'm fat. And they're similarly with thin people, where there's stuff that thin people can do because they're better at doing because they're smaller, and they're not as good at doing because they're not big. And I sort of, for me, it's like, how do we celebrate that spectrum of experience and sort of not see one body or one experience as superior to the other? I think that I'm going to end kind of by saying a couple things like, right, to me, everybody is a good body, recognizes that fatness is a standalone reality that is not an extension of the thin experience. It is not the negative space left behind by thin people.
Mhm.
We have our own robust, incredible world building capacities, right? And the last thing, that fat bodies again are beautiful and sexy and capable and part of a very valuable system of body diversity, and that when we recognize the validity and the like the dignity and the value of every single body regardless of size or health status, we create a better world for every single person. So that's what it means to me. What does it mean to you, Alex?
Yeah, I just want to comment that I love that you came into this like through a fat conference, because I feel like there's always that joke, right, where they're like, oh, hey, do you know so and so? Because like you're fat too, you know? And you met at the conference,
Yeah.
but you like literally did. There was a conference.
Yes.
I feel like for me, everybody is a good body. You know, you were referencing a quote, and I was going to reference this later, but I feel like it's a really good time um, to bring this in. You know, my introduction to disability justice was through this group of queer Black and Brown disabled performers called Sins Invalid, and you know, that was kind of like, I had this like double epiphany in the span of like a year or so moving to the Bay, right? I grew up in Pennsylvania, Central PA, like queer is not a good word, disabled's, you know, disabled's a bad word, you know, so like grew up in these environments where those experiences that I would come into or like actualize and own were not things that were like celebrated, right? They were definitely marks upon you and it was stigmatized. So to come to San Francisco at 24 for grad school and learn about a disability civil rights movement for the first time, having been disabled for 24 years, I was like, what? Like, do I not get a 101 into like my life history? And to then within the same year learn about disability justice, which, you know, elevated disability civil rights, which was important and pivotal and invaluable, and also focused specifically just on disability, right, as like a single issue politic. Whereas disability justice is like, we got queer disabled people, we got sex workers with disabilities, we've got you know, people experiencing homelessness with disabilities. Like we have to hold space for how those things come together. And Sins Invalid did that. And beautifully through art and through dance and performance and talking about sex and disability. And so they have actually a disability justice primer called Skin, Tooth, and Bone. And Patty Byrne, who's the artistic director and kind of like leader of all of these conversations, she said, all body minds are unique and essential. All body minds are whole. All body minds have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful not despite the complexities of our body minds, but because of them. We move together with no body mind left behind. This is disability justice. And so I feel like that, you know, when I facilitate my workshops, it's similar to what you were talking about, this sentence in the middle: we are powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. You know, and I think that really rang true to me in terms of everybody is a good body. You know, just imagining this like really hyperbolic Oprah moment where you're just like, you've got a good body, you've got a good body, you've got a good body. Like the minute that we start, like the minute that you notice yourself or someone else starting to like make comments that feel value-based or moralistic, or, you know, start to determine whose body is more worthy or not, like clock that. That is what we're trying to fight today and dismantle. And I think, you know, what you're speaking about, really looking at how these marginalized experiences play out and the themes that hang on to them. You know, disabled people often are talked about as inherently lacking, right? Having a deficit. I mean, I've grown up and processed the like cosmic irony of like being an amputee and feeling like literally lacking. You know, the way that people treat me as if my body is like at a deficit. You know, I see people out and about and they're like, you know, did you know you could get a prosthetic? And, you know, why do you use crutches? And, you know, this thing where they'd rather me have 4 limbs and be like upset at the way that that's happening because it's dysphoric to me than for me to like be authentically myself and in my body. And so it's, everybody is a good body to me means that like living with disability, you know, being authentic, kind of like working through the messiness, right? Because disability isn't all easy, right? There's a lot of medical needs and issues that come up, you know, mental health obviously doesn't pose this like cakewalk, right, to this liberated future. But it means that your body is not less than, your body is not bad because that's what you're going through, right? You are bringing something to the fold. Like, I love that you're talking about the cultural experience of fatness, of disability, you know, and so if we're trying to weave this like beautiful, magical kind of like rainbow tapestry of all these different experiences, like disabled body minds bring more to that experience. We contribute. There's generative magic and power in disability, and to overlook that or to see disabled bodies and assume a lack of, or to assume you know, to project this like moral sense of like higher ground, right? Because, you know, I have 4 limbs, so that means that I've been living my life better than you, and I know how to tell you what you should or should not be doing. Like, that's kind of where we should start to interrogate this idea of like how that plays out. And it's really easy to get swept up in these things, and I think a lot of learning from fat activism has, particularly around like diet culture talk and like how much people really just rag on like, you know, I'm gonna have another donut, I know I shouldn't. I'm like, just have it, girl, like it's a donut, it's great, you know. Why are we attributing value to food? And you know, to the same extent with bodies and disability, if people want to take care of themselves the way that they want to, like how do we make space for that, as opposed to you know, saying who deserves to experience the like privilege of feeling good in their body.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, I was just thinking about, I was listening to a talk that Temple Grandin was a part of, and she has been a longstanding activist around autism, and she sort of has a similar phrase where it's like, you know, the world needs all these different kinds of minds. Every brain, we need every brain in this world, and every brain in every way that it works. And I think, like, going back to how trauma or marginalization or being different lends itself to these incredible tools and magic. Like, one of the things that I often think about as someone whose body doesn't fit into structures, right? Like, fashion was traditionally a really big challenge for me growing up, not being able to fit into any clothes. Clearly, you know, when I take the commuter train, I'm at risk of being harassed if I want to sit in the middle seat, or if the train is particularly crowded. Similarly, being really afraid of people commenting and being mean to me on airplanes, or if seats in certain venues are very small. So, you know, I think similarly, right, like for anybody who, whether because of fatness or disability, doesn't fit into structures, we're kind of like the experts at sort of at seeing like how these structures need to be improved, right? And like that perspective is so powerful and it's magical. And so for me, it's like, right, the pain of not fitting is legitimate and real and not fair. And also the superpower of being like, oh my God, let me design this building. I can do it in 10 minutes. is also powerful.
That's I've been saying this, I've been like shouting it out so much lately, but Alice Wong in the Bay refers to disabled people as like oracles. You know, like instead of erasing our wisdom and instead of like casting people aside, we should be turning to disabled people and being like, what should the future look like? Because I think, you know, that's a fascinating part about disability as a marginalized experience is like, no one's immune. You know, everybody has, you know, if you live long enough, you're going to become a part of the family. You know what I mean? And so it's like, how do we, like you're saying, turn to the most marginalized people within these communities and say, like, how can we do better? Right? What wisdom do you have to impart on us rather than this kind of like, oh, we'll figure it out. And like, oh, we, like, you know, this like, you know, very homogenous culture of a specific type of person has decided that this is how it is, and surprise, it doesn't work for most people. You know, how do we kind of like flip the script and celebrate, like you said, these superpowers, these oracles that are all around us, right?
Yes, like let a fat person design a chair, for God's sake. No one likes the chair, right? Like no one, I don't know. Anyway, I'm not going to get into chairs, but
I
I
cannot wait
just
for your chair uncledom.
oh my goodness, oh my goodness. Okay, but Alex, so the next thing that we had wanted to talk about was sort of like, okay, we're talking about the construction of good bodies and like making room for everybody, but and this conversation is required because of the ways that our bodies are constructed as bad. So what is the quote unquote the bad body construction?
Yeah. Who's to blame? Who's at fault? I think that's what we're doing today. By the way, you're already getting popped off in the chat. People are ready to buy your chairs. So I will take it. You know, when we were prepping for this, like the talking about, you know, where do bad bodies come from? I think, you know, it was pretty easy to agree that like so much of this is socially constructed, right? And from a disabled lens or from a disability lens, like the medical model is so much to blame and a part of the problem, right? You know, this medical model, this idea that like when you're born or if at some point you acquire a disability or an impairment, right? If medicine can be applied and you can't be quote unquote fixed, then you're disabled. And you know, really what that does is it just kind of it pathologizes individuals. It doesn't look at the systemic issues, right? If you know, my parents dealt with this when I was younger. The doctors just were like, he won't be able to walk. You know, they gave my parents a lot of like doom and gloom, and really there weren't conversations around, you know, these systems are the problem, right? The society that we have is not ready for this like precocious, energetic little amputee, you know? I'm ready to like bounce and bound everywhere, and they're ready to say it's my body's fault rather than saying, you know, the society should be better. And so, you know, the social model of disability really kind of interrogates society's contributions to, you know, these marginalized and traumatic experiences. You know, I think a lot about like even not just, you know, disability. I think people really focus in on physical disabilities, right? I think that's a lot easier to sink your teeth into because it can be this like easy math problem, right? Of, well, Alex is an amputee, so he'll need an elevator instead of stairs, or that person's a wheelchair rider, so they need you know, a ramp instead of stairs. But, you know, we're also talking about mental health, right? And non-apparent disabilities, where those aren't as easy because they're more dynamic, right? Sometimes people are having a flare-up and aren't able to walk, and sometimes they can. And for people who are non-disabled and don't have this consciousness, it's like this magic trick that should not be astounding, right? Bodies behave strangely. You know, we have all these jokes about like, oh, my wobbly knee. But, you know, if a disabled person literally has a wobbly knee, then all of a sudden it's like, I don't know what to do. You were walking yesterday, you know. And so I think what I really love about challenging like these microaggressions and these ideas of like bad bodies is saying that the system is deeming these bodies to be bad, right, or treating them badly, and we should be looking at how we can help people feel empowered to define what health and wellness means for them, right? Whether it's mental health, or you talk really beautifully about, you know, what diet and nutrition can mean from like a joyful perspective, how we can have access and not feel bad for asking for it, right? I know that's something I experience. I have a lot of, on the disability side, the construction of this is like ableism, right? This idea that disabled people by default are inferior. And so it's kind of silly that I have times where I don't want to ask for help, when it's like, well, the system made, you know, our society made a situation where I have to ask for help. So I shouldn't be the one carrying that burden. And so that's kind of what I like to help encourage disabled people to process, is like, how have we adopted these messages that we are the problem, that our bodies are bad versus our society is doing a bad job accommodating our good bodies.
Yes, I love that. I completely agree. I can really relate to being like a very bouncy, ebullient child. I mean, I was a jiggle enthusiast. I used to jiggle all the time, and I really saw my jiggle as a superpower. Literally, I was like, oh my God, my body moves like water. My body moves like a trampoline or whatever, right? Like, I knew that feeling that my fat gave me was special. Like, somehow I knew that not other people didn't have it. Like, I knew my smaller friends didn't have that jiggle thing, and I felt like kind of special because I did. And so anyway, jiggling was my superpower. So therefore fat was my superpower. Being fat was my superpower. And I was energetic and very like assertive. I knew exactly what I wanted. There was a clear line between me and what I wanted, whether it was like my 4-year-old crush Ray Ray, who became my boyfriend, obviously, or, you know, or this snack or this experience or whatever. And similarly for me, like, my fat was not a problem at all for me until people made it a problem. But until, right, like, I think what's hard is, right, like, there was never anything wrong with me being fat. There is not anything wrong with me being fat. What's wrong is people's attitudes towards me because I'm fat. And yet the blame of that experience is placed on me because I am deviating from whatever is supposed to be considered a normal body. Yep. And so my fat was not a problem until someone told me that it was. And I think it's important to kind of define, you know, that in our culture right now, our attitudes towards fat people are considered legitimate concerns for health concerns, right? Like, legitimate concerns for other people's health is how we understand our attitudes towards fat people right now. Yeah. What in actuality it is it's a form of bigotry and discrimination. Yep. Fat phobia, called fat phobia, right? Like, fat phobia has all the same criteria, right? Like, when you think about the criteria of how do we know something is a form of oppression or a form of discrimination, it has all the criteria, right? Like, for example, like, a really clear example of how you know something is discriminatory is if a member of the dominant group and a member of the marginalized group are doing the same exact behavior, they're interpreted differently. The double standard is like a huge red flag that discrimination is happening. I mean, we just saw this happen with, like, where it's like, you know, a lighter skinned person or a white person gets to jog and not get murdered, and a black person cannot do that, right? Similarly, like, a thin person wears a tube top and maybe it's like acceptable or no one even notices, or maybe it's constructed as sexy, and then a fat person does it and we're considered like sloppy or super slutty, I'm just trying to not be hot because it's hot outside. hence the tube top. I wear tube tops when it's hot, right? And so, like, instead of me just meeting a corporeal need, my need is pathologized as like deviant, right? And under discrimination. Anyway, so like, I mean, I think I went from this child who was like fully feeling herself to a child who felt deeply like, who was taught systematically, something is wrong with your body, here's how you fix it, that is dieting.
Yep.
And until you become a thin person, we're going to keep torturing you indefinitely. Yeah. And so, like, good luck with that, and that's your fault. And like the victim blaming inherent to that kind of ideology, where it's like, oh, you can stop this anytime you want, Virgie, you just have to be thin. Yeah. You have this horrible lack of willpower, which is making us have to torture you emotionally. And so, right, like that kind of victim blaming that's inherent to it. But to go back to kind of like, you know, the bad body, essentially, I kind of wanted to, God, I have so many notes. Let's see. Okay, let's talk about, like, I'm gonna skip around a little bit, but like, yeah, the idea that our bodies are fat because we have an out of control appetite, we lack willpower, we have lower moral standards, we don't have discipline, etc., right? Like, there's these horrible ideas and that are myths about why people who are bigger are bigger. In reality, right, we understand that, again, body diversity is a really powerful thing. There have always been bigger people and smaller people, and we need to absolutely stop worrying about why someone is fat, because if that's your condition for giving someone respect, dignity, or care, something is wrong with you, not them. Okay. Yeah. So, but like, I wanted to kind of get into, sort of the spectrum model of like the bad body construction, and like how marginalization and stigma happens kind of on a spectrum. And I kind of wanted to bring in the invisible versus visible disability / trauma framework into this. So for example, an example of like, I think both, like, let me back up and say, most people have been taught and internalized ideas that something is wrong with their body. And most people have internalized the idea that they should be a smaller size than they are. And so that's a reality that most of us share. When we get into the spectrum, we have to recognize that, you know, most of us are starting from that place. But the bigger your body is, / if you have other marginalizing identities that are intersecting, the more impact you're having in terms of the stigma spectrum. Mm-hmm. So, and if we're just talking about fatness, right, like a larger body person is going to have a lot more impact with institutions, like I was saying, around like clothing fitting, seats fitting, being able to even like things like being able to find a partner because you're facing weight-based discrimination, right? Yeah. The higher your weight, the more impact you're having on that spectrum, or the more you're impacted on that spectrum. And to go to like visible and invisible disabilities and trauma, I wanted to use the example of disordered eating. So we have evidence like many higher weight people, probably most higher weight people, are dieting chronically and have been since childhood. It might actually be more like a diagnosable eating disorder, right? But because we think of disordered eating as only ever something that happens when a person is white, very thin, and typically a young woman, right? Like, if you're a higher weight person or a person of color or a higher weight person of color, your eating disorder might be entirely invisible to both you and your community and your doctor. So, I think like it's interesting and useful to kind of consider, right, that that someone might have what is an eating disorder, right, is considered a mental illness.
Yeah.
Right, and like but in general, who's getting that care? They're white, straight, cisgender, young women,
Yeah.
and not others who might also be experiencing the extraordinary distress of needing to be recovered around their eating. And then the last thing I wanted to sort of talk about was actually the bad body in the context of COVID. So in 2013, the American Medical Association decided to classify higher weight as obesity as a disease, against the recommendations of the committee to which the issue was assigned. And the way that kind of plays into COVID, is that, because in our culture, being obese or fatness is considered an elective disease, a disease that's like a disease that is preventable. I have to just heavily quote all of this because it's all poop garbage. But anyway, but because this is considered like an elective quote unquote disease, and being fat is considered apparently a comorbidity factor for COVID. This brings up issues of people in the culture seeing fat people as vectors of disease, right? Like people who need to be questioned, who you need to stay away from, who are putting you at risk of other things. I feel like this kind of particular COVID scapegoating that's happening with fat people reminds me a lot of the really problematic research that happened, before COVID that's been ongoing. Like there's several studies that have been fully funded around trying to see if even just being around a fat person makes you have worse diet decisions, which is just like horrific. Anyway, so this brings up issues of seeing fat people again as vectors, or fat people as taking much needed resources from healthy people who are trying hard. And then I think for fat people further, the fear of acquiring COVID is compounded by a fear of whether they will be seen as a bad patient, whether the hospital equipment will accommodate their body, whether or not they're going to get some kind of like fat shaming talk before their symptoms are taken seriously, because that is the experience of fat people in medical scenarios. I could go on and on and on for quite some time, but I'm curious if you have thoughts that you want to offer around this, or around frameworks that we use to liberate ourselves, or the psychosocial impacts of having a bad body, or any of those themes, Alex.
I know. I'm looking at our notes. I'm like, there's so many things we could talk about.
That's true.
I mean, just so much of what you brought up, I think, again, the parallels, or maybe something I just want to like name as well. I'm sure that we've kind of talked around this, but also just offering, like, there are, these conversations, right? Disability justice, fat activism, mental health, like, there are disabled fat people who are experiencing mental health challenges. These aren't mutually exclusive. And so, to what you brought up so many times, right, these intersections can compound the challenges that people are experiencing. And, this COVID example that you're bringing up, there's been really amazing conversations within the disability community, both around, there's a hashtag, no body is disposable, right? And kind of clocking the like flavor of eugenics that's happening right now, where people are, these hospitals are talking about really toxic and problematic like triaging practices, right? Where they would determine whose body is more important to treat or assess. And again, that plays into this idea of like certain bodies are less good, right? Or that certain people get to determine whose body is more good or more worthy or more deserving of life, right? Or the assumption of quality of life, right? That if you're disabled, you inherently have, lower quality of life. So why would we help you out? Like, you're already a lost cause anyway. you know, and the gross assumptions that lie in that. There's also kind of the flip side of that, where, again, to that superpower oracle conversation, disabled people have been organizing digitally and remotely for years, right? They've been doing Zoom, they've been having these Skype sessions, planning and organizing on Twitter, and with spreadsheets and all of these things. So when our society hits this like screeching halt, in a way where everybody's kind of like losing their minds and saying like, I don't know what to do, how are we going to do all of these things, and disabled people are like, I've been new. We've been doing this. And so it's just like, it's really, I think it's a painful, like bittersweet I told you so for a lot of people who have been feeling like, when their body needs rest, or when systems are not accessible, when their mind needs rest, right? Like taking time to attend to your mental health oftentimes has been, because of capitalism and the way that we push, go, like those people are deemed as like lazy or unproductive, right? Or like leeching off the system. And it's, I'm falling into your air quotes now. It's like the veil has been lifted, and it's clear that those systems haven't been working, right? They damage all of us. All of us are negatively impacted by those things. And there have been people who have been trying to provide that perspective for years, and their voices haven't been heard. Or they have been heard and they've been ignored, right? Or erased or invalidated. So I really want to, it's almost 8. I would love to use some of our time before Q&A to talk about like some of the frameworks that we're using to liberate ourselves from these ideas. And I really want to get to this like mental health conversation for you and I as activists and organizers and culture makers, like what we use, right? And then kind of hear what other people are using or what questions that they have. So why don't I turn it to you, Virgie? What frameworks are you using to liberate yourself from this idea of like a bad body?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite, my mantra, my like rallying cry is every single person deserves to live a life free from bigotry and discrimination, regardless of size or health status. And I think that that's kind of, I think that's one of the pillars and frameworks of fat activism, right? Like not asking, why is someone fat? What's going to happen to your health if you're fat? Like all these, like just being like, you know what? This is a human being who deserves dignity, care, love, respect. And it doesn't matter. Those things have to be unconditional. And I think it's important from like a national perspective, a cultural psychic perspective, right? Like if love, care, dignity, and respect are conditional upon corporeal adherence in some way, we're actually talking about a really retrograde reality that's terrifying. And so we need to kind of, I think from a philosophical perspective, really think of it in that way, right? Like when we create stigma, when we promote oppression, we create a reality in which the resources that every human being needs are conditional.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I mean, that's the definition of like a violent retrograde civil, like non-civilization, right? And so those kinds of questions and observations are really important to me. And I think for sure guiding questions, you mentioned this, like how do we reduce harm to the most impacted and most vulnerable bodies? And I often, as a liberatory framework, it's really helpful. And I just wrote about this in the new book, looking at body justice work as a 3-story house, where the first level is kind of self-love, self-care. How do we put the oxygen mask for ourselves, right, before we can like super help other people with their oxygen mask. And then the second level is community and familial shifts. And then the third level is really cultural and institutional change. And kind of always thinking of the whole house, when we're thinking about this work. And even when we're leaning into self-love, or we're leaning into organizational work around culture shifts, just remembering all the floors of the house and checking in about how those are feeling, how those are doing. So those are mine.
Yeah, I love that house metaphor.
Yeah.
I feel like for me, you know, I just like disability justice is my religion. You know, it's something that uh, I'm just enjoying the pleasure of diving deeper into every day, and like learning more and processing and like unburdening myself, and hopefully like helping others do the same. Patty Byrne, there's a blog post. I've seen Elaine kind of drop some resources in the chat, so maybe I can send it when you're talking next, Virgie, or half the time I just Google like Patty Byrne disability justice framework. But there's 10 tenets, and you know, just so many of them. I think that's the beautiful part about disability justice, is that like, I think you were talking about this earlier, you know, like it benefits everybody. You know, I think about those like really excruciating rebuttals to like Black Lives Matter, where people are like, all lives matter. I'm like, if you understood what people were talking about, you would not be framing it this way, right? And so disability justice is very similar, where it's not just for disabled people, like everybody benefits from these frameworks around, thank you, Elaine, from like sustainability, right? That's one of the frameworks. And that feels so relevant right now, right? We're in this like certainty and chaos and confusion, and we have to sustain, right? We can't burn ourselves out. We can't overproduce, because it's the long haul, right? We have to make it through this. Cross movement solidarity is a really beautiful part of disability justice, right? This conversation we're having right now, how can disabled people show up for fat folks? How can fat folks show up for disabled people? How can we be in conversation and just be like, fuck chairs? Chairs are fucking annoying, right? For everybody. So I think those kind of things really call to me. And the last thing I'll say about this is just, I really appreciate the cross disability solidarity that's brought up, in that, you know, disability justice isn't for me as an amputee to like liberate myself and other amputees and then clock out, right? Like, I'm here to do this work to help support and empower and liberate neurodivergent folks, right? People living with mental health disabilities, people who, you know, might not, these kind of speaking engagements are not their jam, right? But how do we bring their voices in? Or, you know, how do I use my power later to tag somebody else in, right? And kind of exploring that understanding that there's kind of a hierarchy at times within disability, and that I have privilege, you know, as like a cis man with a higher education, with a full-time job, like I have a lot of power that I can wield, and how do I utilize that, as opposed to like pouting and being like, I have privilege. Like that's one of the
Yes.
things that like always kills me, when people are like, well, I don't want to be privileged, or like privilege is a bad word. I'm like, no, if you use the term social power instead, you know, if that needs to be done, which I hate that we have to like comfort some people around their privilege, but it's not a bad thing. We all should have the things that come with privilege. It's just that certain people are afforded it more easily. And so I think that's what disability justice does for me. It just provides this guiding light in so many different ways that I feel like it empowers me. And I also feel like I can invite other people to consider for themselves how this way of living can make their lives better, and their communities better too.
Yes, totally. I mean, I was thinking about like, I made a little, I mean, we both made lists, but like one of my, I just want to kind of go through some of the bullets for like strategies for repair for people who are inside these impacted populations. I mean, I've really been realizing lately that the work that we're doing is not just intellectual, it's not just happening in the brain, it's not just deconstruction and processing, though that's really important. The work is also corporeal, it's spiritual, and it's heart work. Because a lot of times we're not just hurt by an idea. We're not just people who have a bad idea in our head, and once we get that out of our head, we're fine, right? We all know that's not how that works. But like for when we're talking about when we're talking about a wound, we're talking about leaving space to heal. And for some people like myself, the intellectual work happens before and at the same time and concurrently as that corporeal healing. But you know, it really looks like sort of, what does it look like to not just arm myself with the language that I need to articulate what's happening to me? It's like moving into that space where you can be like, I actually deserve more than just armor. I deserve to just be more than just a warrior all the time. And I think for a lot of us, and for a lot of people, for various reasons, they can't afford not to be a warrior all the time. And I understand that. I've been in that space. But like, how do we like, for me, it was like feeling like I deserved more than being in that space felt like the work of justice and healing that I needed. The second thing I wanted to share was like remembering that the stigma, discrimination, and oppression that you experience is never your fault. I think that we need to be reminded of this. The third thing is that remembering that every single person is worthy and precious 100% of the time, unconditionally.
Yeah.
So I often tell people, one question that people find really useful as sort of like a framing question is like, what would I do right now if I felt like I was precious beyond belief? You know, and like, how do we kind of, I think what I love is we can ask that question for ourselves, and we can also ask that questions for like the planet, like humanity, right? What if I 100% truly and utterly like accepted that every single human life was precious, that every life was precious? And how would that inform me, my practice, how I walk through the world, how I have relationships, whether I'm going to sleep with that person or not? And then number I think the last thing for me is like feeling the spectrum of human emotion. I think for me, like when I think about my own journey, and this is this is sort of personal healing tool stuff. I think like, right, when you're stigmatized, it's such an uncomfortable, acutely upsetting experience. And a lot of times we're reluctant to allow ourselves to have the sort of the full spectrum of human experience, which includes like vulnerability, grief, sadness, recognizing that like this moment is not fair, and rather than shutting down and going into like our armor mode, if we can, sort of just allowing ourselves to be like, all right, that happened, it hurt me a lot, I can't believe another human being treated me like I wasn't a full human being. And the feeling that's bringing up is grief and sadness and rage and the hard feelings that we often don't want to feel, right? And the more wounded we are, the less appealing that those feelings feel. And yet I do feel like the work of justice is actually the restoration of full humanity to every single person. And that's a very lofty goal, but I'm sort of like, you know what, I can hold that dream for myself and for others. And it only takes a few of us to be able to do that, right? For us to make change. So those, I think that's all I have to say on that. Do you have anything you wanted to add, Alex?
Well, I mean, I have so many things I want to say. I just appreciate you. Given we have about like maybe 20 minutes left, if
Yes.
you want to tackle some of these questions, and then we can like close with that like pleasure activism, like joy kind of like takeaway kind of. How does that sound?
Yes.
I'm gonna turn my light on because we're getting like I was going with natural light and she's leaving. I'll let you pick the first question and then we'll tackle it together.
Okay. I Can someone help me with the questions? Like Elaine, I don't like. I'm only seeing the chats as they're coming up because I'm doing it on my phone. I'm doing the Zoom on my phone.
Okay.
Gotcha. No, I can do it. I can do it. Okay.
Okay.
Or Alex, do you want to do it, or do you want me to do it?
Yeah. I can. Let me look at these questions.
Okay. I'll let you choose.
I saw one. I'll ask this one to start, and it seems geared towards disability, but obviously, I think Virgie can speak to how you came into this with your identities. But this says, how have you built the positivity to be comfortable in your body as someone with a disability? And so for me, oh my gosh, I like winded just from hopping around my room. Coming into positivity around the so much of it is about surrounding myself with like positive representation, right? And these like possibility models that kind of confront the negative stereotypes and messages that I've been told about myself. Because then, to the points that we bringing up all night, then it removes it from an individual standpoint, right? And it starts to provide this context of like a societal issue. And so if I see other people who look like me or act like me in their authenticity and living their truth, I'm like, yo, girl, like I could be doing that too, right? In a way that works for me, and it feels less like it's up to me as an individual to like surmount all of these things, right? To see somebody else surmounting it really helps. And then that's kind of where Glamputee came from, right? It was this kind of like aspirational Sasha Fierce, kind of like alter ego where I'm like, I'm not there all the time, but I'm trying to like really own that this part of me really makes me, right? And that I can like exist in the world really proudly with that. And that in doing so, I can be a beacon for someone else, even if that's not me every day, even if I have hard days living with a disability. It's not always perfect or easy, but it feels great. And I think the last thing I'll say is just trying to identify, like, as I think Virgie, you said earlier tonight, right? Like, what are some of the benefits, right, that disability gives me, rather than viewing it as like inherently negative. I'm hopping around all the time, like, I got a nice leg, it's a free butt workout all the time. I joke, if I wore my prosthetic, then I'd have to work out my arms. Like I'm on my crutches all the time. I've got some definition. I like it, right? And so kind of like having fun and being playful with what it brings into my life, as opposed to only viewing it as a negative that I have to overcome. How about for you? How have you come into positivity around your identity?
I mean, I don't know. I feel like you answered the question. I kind of want to I loved it, and it was amazeballs. So I'm happy to take the next question.
Yeah, totally. Let's see. We've got a question about representation in media. There's a question about, I think if I click, let's see. Oh, okay. There's also a question about relationships with people who are kind of doing some of the work still, right? Maybe some people who still like espousing isms. Age and body shaming. Does it make it harder?
I mean, can we talk about the relationship with isms? I also just have to say I got a notification that the 1998 version of Cats is going to be streaming, and I'm feeling some kind of way about it, and I just have to share that with you. Okay, but let's talk about the relationship and the ism.
This talk sponsored by the 1998 streaming of Cats. This question says, how do you approach close relationships around you who are willing to support you, but when confronted with other bodies that are fat or disabled, do not give the same critical thought?
Yeah, I mean, I actually would love to hear your thoughts on this. Like, I can really relate to this from as a fat person when I was dating not fat positive people previously, because I didn't hold that identity for myself. I actually found that often they would, if I would, like there's so many, I don't know where to start. I want to start this story. I guess, I just remember dating people as like a fat person, dating straight men in particular, who would often talk critically about other women who looked almost exactly like me in terms of like we're both fat, right? and then they would tell me, oh, but you're not fat, I don't see you that way, you look much better than she does, or something like that. And I realize in retrospect that was actually about their discomfort with desiring a fat person. They were doing that performance for themselves. It wasn't about me at all. It was about them performing a script so that they could feel comfortable with a desire that they maybe didn't feel entirely comfortable with. Because, I mean, certainly, like, if you're a dude and you're desiring fat bodies, you're immediately considered a pervert in our culture. And for me, unfortunately, I found that really comforting, because I wasn't comfortable identifying as a fat person at that time. And so I think it's important. I mean, I really do think it's important to interrogate, what's that about? And it might be a conversation that you have internally to begin with. Like, what's it about? How does it make me feel? And then I think it's important to say, right, like for me, hard and fast, dating wise, I do not date anybody who speaks negatively about anybody else's body, period. And I mean, that's a very high standard as somebody who's like a straight woman. And so like, right. And in which I was vetting like 90% plus like of straight men, but I think it ultimately created a reality where I met somebody who's amazing, and like I'm really in love with this person. But I do think that partners who critique other people's bodies, I do consider that a red flag. If I were initially dating them, that would be like a factor that would lead to like not having a second date. I think if you're invested in the relationship and you want to give this person the benefit of the doubt, I would sort of sit down with them, be very clear about your concerns, and then kind of leave it up to them in terms of like, how are you going to make this behavior better? Because this is something I don't want to see moving forward in our relationship. And then I personally, as like a high executive function Taurus, would put a deadline in my phone as to when I needed to see what percentage of improvement.
Oh my God.
Based on what criteria. So that's just how I would do it. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's helping me because my rising Virgo is just like, oh, I didn't even think to put that in the calendar. Hold them accountable.
Yes, put it on the calendar.
I really love the way that you are naming that vetting process can really select a lot of people out, and at the same time, it paid off, right? Like you the rewards came in, and I saw a comment in the chat about like dating while fat can be stressful, and it's just kind of like, because of these isms, right? Like this is a stressful process, right? For fat people, for disabled people, for marginalized bodies. It can be more stressful when you, like you said, allow that kind of behavior in your life, right? Of people saying disparaging things and doing that like double talk, right? Where they're like, that person's unattractive, or that person's sloppy, or, their disability makes me uncomfortable, but you're fine, it is kind of, how do you hold yourself accountable to like what can cause you that pain, right? And like holding those boundaries. The mental calculus that I do, and you alluded to, right, is like, what is my investment with this relationship, right? Is it a first date? Is that a buy, right? I went on a first date once, and this I had, my nails painted, and the guy asked me if I was a drag queen, and I was like, we're not. This is not a second date that like you're attributing these like assumptions and things that don't feel good. But if it's a close friend, if it's a family member, if it's somebody you've been dating for a long time, right? You've put that investment and you have that trust to explore the foundation of your relationship, right? Is that something that they're willing to work on their own? I think that's something else, right? To remember is that, like, if somebody is trying to explore their ableism or their fat phobia, for them to do it with you is putting you at risk and making you do emotional labor that you have to do all the time anyway, right? And so, like, do they have other friends that they can process this with? Do they have a therapist that they can go to? Like, what podcasts are you reading? What books are you listening to? What books are you reading? Like, how are you taking it off of marginalized people to do that emotional labor for you? I think that's really huge for me. And like you said, right, if you don't see change, or if people don't demonstrate that interest in change, that's where that's kind of where I walk, right? If it feels as though, if it feels like they really mean it versus that face value of like, well, I don't want to be fat phobic, I don't want to be ableist. I'm like, well, hopefully nobody would outright say that that's what they want to do, right? But
Yeah.
is your commitment leading to action versus, right, are you just saying I'm down, right, and then you kind of just expect that person to do the work for you?
Yes. Can I just add that, like, one framework that a friend gave me that I thought was so valuable? She was talking about, she was actually wrote this incredible essay about finding out that she had been diagnosed with herpes and what it was like having, what it was like dating after she had the diagnosis. And she was like, there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of discomfort, there's a new level of vulnerability, but my God, herpes is like the most incredible vetting tool on the planet, right? She was kind of like, I wish that I like maybe didn't have to deal with this? Sure. But like, have people shown me who they are through my disclosure? Yes. Have I been grateful for that information? Yes. And right, like, I mean, I don't, like, obviously, having a disability or being fat is not the same as like having herpes, but like in the same way, it's a useful framework for, like, it's a stigmatized reality,
Yeah.
right? Like, it's a stigmatized sexual phenomenon. And if you can kind of bring that framework of like strength, where it's like, all right, I did not opt into being stigmatized, but I will tell you that being fat is an extraordinary vetting tool. People show you who they are from the very beginning because you're living in a marginalized body that is not valued in the same way that, like, whatever, they've been socialized and taught to act like a certain way in front of. And so, like, you get to see this unfiltered self, and like that can be very painful, but I take it as a gift, because the truth of the matter is that, like, I would not have seen this until like 3 years into our relationship if I were more privileged, and then I would have to like divorce you and take our children away, and I just don't have to deal with that now.
Yeah, we don't want to get into all that litigation. That's a lot of work.
No, just show me you're a dirtbag on the first date and I can move on.
I will say I'm sad that I wouldn't get to see your like courtroom attire. I feel like it would be yeah, but I feel like you're totally hitting the nail on the head, that it's that quality over quantity kind of thing. And I know I'm in a privileged place to say that, but I know that I'm dating, sex, like I'm just having better connections with people because of the way that I'm holding those boundaries and holding my value and not like compromising that, because like you're saying, over time it eats away at you, right? And that's kind of the opposite of what we want to do.
Yes.
We have like 5 minutes, which is hard because there's all these questions. And
sorry, I'll
yeah,
quickly speak up,
no,
as I have no head on this thing right now. So I absolutely understand if people need to go. If you all are, interested and willing to keep talking, I'm okay with it, but I want to make sure that you all are as well, and be my, and I know, people have other time constraints, but if you do want to talk while other people stay, that is up to you. I'm happy to hear you.
Thank you.
I know. I'm always love a chance to talk with Virgie. I know I gotta get some dinner in a second.
Oh gosh, yes.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if, I know we got some great questions, if maybe, people could direct that to like social media or different ways of reaching
Yeah,
out.
and what we can do is I can I'll take note of the questions. I think it'll save them, and if you all want to answer them elsewhere or later, and I can put them on Facebook or I can put them somewhere else. Does
Yeah.
that sound like a possibility?
Yeah, that works for me.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we can do that, and you all can take it back. Sorry.
No, it's no worries at all. Maybe just to close out, Virgie, because we've talked about this a little bit, but one of the things that I like to close with is like that idea of Adrienne Marie Brown's pleasure activism, right? And like you talked about this joyful process of liberation, which is really, I think, at the heart of what she's saying. And so for you, just for the people tuning in, like what are some things that are giving you pleasure in your activism and like helping you sustain your mental health amidst all of this really deep and challenging work?
Yes, I mean, I've been finding I'm thinking about the like there's this incredible they're like they're a sister duo, and they have this incredible project where they're knitting the coral reef. They're knitting a replica like in real reef, and they have this extraordinary book that they've written where they really talk about the role of the digital, the role of hands in working through pain, in working through difficulty, in working through fear, and working through uncertainty. So I think of their work all the time when I think about the things that I'm doing with my hands lately, like like cooking and sewing um just like and baking and touching food and touching things. And I've noticing like at the beginning of COVID in particular, I was like drumming on a lot of things, and that felt really good. And just kind of like really seeing the body as deeply wise and having all of this extraordinary knowledge that we can tap into. Like if we can kind of quiet it down a little bit, maybe do some meditation or something, if we can quiet down the noise that we have, our body tells us what it wants to do, right? It knows how to mourn, it knows how to be joyful, it knows how to have sex, it knows how to orgasm, it knows how to do all these extraordinary things. And we can kind of just like, we actually can stand back and get out of its way so it can like do this amazing stuff that it does. But I've just been noticing like how my body just wants to move through emotion, and I just kind of can do that through dancing or cooking or whatever. I totally love tarot. I'm somebody who tarot has been a big part of intuition restoration, which as someone who is in recovery from dieting and diet culture, that restoration of intuition is really important to me. I definitely think like sexuality has been such an important part. Like I have had so much fun. I've been doing a lot of Google Duo video calls with my partner, and he's sort of like a shy Midwesterner, but I have so much fun just being like putting on my little show. 'Cause, how you can see yourself on like these different video apps, and I'm just like putting on my own little sexy show. I'm like, this isn't even for you. This butt show is for me. And so like, there's something really wonderful about like the I've been calling it like redesigning the visual rubric to include my fat body, right? Like, what does my fat body look like when I'm orgasming? What does my fat body look like when I'm laughing? What does my fat body look like when I'm running or I'm jumping or I'm like lying down? Because we don't have that visual rubric out there in the culture. And so I'm not going to keep feeling alienated from my own body. So if I have to create that rubric through selfies and through FaceTime, I'm going to do it. And I think it's like a really powerful tool. So those are mine.
I love those.
Oh, and also bubbly water.
Yes, you're
The end.
you're bubbly water. It's so funny that you are describing those like butt pictures as for you, because part of Adrienne Marie Brown's like pleasure activist, like she has a part of the book that's like 5 tools to kick off your journey, and one of them is self-pornography, right?
Yes.
I'm so into that idea of like redesigning that rubric, because I have tried to do that for myself, and then as a Leo, I want to share. I can't just keep it to myself. I'm like, my butt looks too good. I can't just be keeping that. I gotta share that. So yes, in these quarantine shelter times, I've been enjoying some long distance communiques, and you know, I think tarot's definitely been something really fun to like that intuition building, but for me, you know, processing things can be really hard. You know, the irony for me as a counselor is that I have this like distance from a lot of things because of the body traumas that I've experienced, and I think touching those things feels really hot, you know, and so having an outside entity or source or tool to reflect on those things on my time when I'm ready, and like having those like collective unconscious kind of big archetypal conversations with myself and the universe has been really enriching, and yeah, just like slowing down. I feel like that's been a huge thing of, you know, doing this work has been so amazing and fulfilling to me, and it's kind of intoxicating, right, to like get to have conversations where you're in the driver's seat and people listen and don't push back or challenge you, or if they do, you're like, I'm still getting paid. So it's very different than, you know, everyday life where people can just sling these things at you. And so I got in a rhythm where I was doing so much that I didn't really have time to take care of myself. And so that's, I think, been just a really big part of the joy of like slowing down, is being like, oh, I can like read or like take a nap. I don't know, you know. So I think that's what's been keeping me going. And adornment, that's another part. I love all the little trinkly moments. I love a nail painting party, all of that stuff. It's nice to feel like a little zhuzh in all of this gloom, you know.
Yes, I agree completely. Alex, should we share where people can find us and then say bye?
Thank you. I'm terrible at these promos, so I'm glad that you did that.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I'll let you go first. I'll follow up.
You can find me on Instagram at Virgie Tovar, VirgieTovar, or virgietovar.com. My new book, again, is The Self-Love Revolution, Radical Body Positivity for Girls of Color. It's fantastic for like providers, teachers, therapists, parents, and honestly, if you're really new to self-love and body justice, it's also good for grown-ups. And if you are excited to kind of do something kind of fun for yourself, I'm hosting a pajama party movie night on Saturday. We're going to be screening Julie and Julia on Netflix Party, and you can find all the details in the link in my bio at Instagram at virgietovar.com.
Oh, that's so fun. I love that.
Thank you.
It seems like, I know you said you didn't get to check out the chat, but you're getting some love in the chat. Some people are getting flowers. So just wanted to let you know. I'm also on Instagram. That's usually the place I'm on most. So at Glamputee, GLAMPUTEE. Get in touch. Let's talk. I've got some fun stories in my highlights of me ranting and answering questions. And your girl loves to twirl to some music. So like, let's share, let's talk, let's gab. And you can also check out my website, glamputee.com. I have a resource guide. I have 2 resource guides on there with lots of info. I think that's that's a huge part of, you know, what Virgie's doing is this information sharing. And I think that's really important to help make that available. And like, you know, I love when people are like, I don't know where to start. And I'm like, do I have a resource guide for you? So I've got some podcast episodes and things that I've talked elsewhere on there too. So check us out. Be in touch. Virgie, this is amazing.
Thank you so much, everyone, and Elaine and Alex.
Yes, thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Burlingame Library. Thank you, Virgie, for everything that you do. I can't wait to like tune in and read more and just like giggle more together.
Yes. Mwah. Bye.
Bye.
All right. Thank you so much, all. Sorry, I know you're like about to like leave us. This is mainly for the attendees. Please fill out a survey. I've been linking it. I will try to link it again. Thank you so much to Virgie and Alex. This was, I was really excited to have them here. Bye, Virgie. I'm waving, but you can't see me. So thank you so much. All right, and thank you to the attendees for joining us. I'm going to, hopefully we'll get it onto Facebook and possibly our YouTube, and we'll link it on our website and on our Facebook. And then if you want more information, you can check our website in regards to the Burlingame Read stuff. We're going to have a virtual art night on the 26th. We're going to have Esme, Wei Jun, Wayne on the 28th. All right, thanks so much for sticking it out till the end. We will see you all later. Bye.